A CloudOps workday is filled with many big and small tasks. Dealing with a constant task stream is becoming an ever bigger burden than many realize. It's time to talk about task automation. This is OpsTalk podcast. Here we talk about the real, everyday CloudOps reality. I'm Rick Habley. Thanks for tuning in. With me today is Luke Walker. Luke runs product management at MontyCloud. Great to have you, Luke. Today we're talking about the task stream. What does that mean? What problems do these task streams present?
Thanks, Rick, and it's great to join OpsTalk. So here's what I'm seeing. The reward for working hard is more work, and nothing could be more true for an operations team. You've got companies expanding their cloud footprints, they're migrating more workloads, refactoring more applications, and building more natively in the cloud. But unlike a project with a fixed start end, your typical CloudOps team has this never-ending stream of tasks, and it's no surprise to find teams can't hire or spend fast enough to meet this accelerating demand of work.
True that. Can you tell us what kind of tasks we're even talking about and how that can spin out of control? Is it simply related to the amount of resources living in the cloud?
Most look at the amount of resources deployed, but it's really about your application consumption increasing. The more people using your apps, the more tasks appearing within your ops backlog. Now, app consumption, this is a good thing. It means you're delivering value to the business, and that's what you're building for. But are you ready for the operations load that comes with it? Your teams are then under pressure when you assess the priority, volume, and sequencing of these tasks that must take place to maintain your service levels. Yet, trying to carve out time to find a more efficient way to cope with that pressure is a constant struggle that I hear from customers.
Can you give me an example of that?
Watching your ops team be buried by report deployment is definitely one place to start. One of our early customers, they're a luxury jewelry retailer with stores all over the world, and they built their enterprise data hub on Amazon using 10 AWS services, including a mix of ECS, EMR, and Elasticsearch. The whole point is to run analytics against their point of sales data. And once application consumption increased, the team was getting more and more requests for changes to existing or new reports. And that itself then created even more tasks to process the changes, redeploy, and scale their clusters to meet the new demand. But that's also where the bigger problem lies. Like many other projects, while infrastructure as code handled the deployment, those same tools generally don't deal with the operational aspects of an application. And then this was then further compounded with all of the customer's operations being built organically. So think about it like this. Your tooling, your alerting, and the automation of those onboarding tasks was only completed as required. So the operations team found themselves needing days to push, test, and measure simple report updates, and even months to push a new release into production or even just implement new monitoring rules. And it gets worse as you realize the manual task execution, say deploying a resource, integrating services, and setting up IAM roles across multiple teams. This creates many inconsistencies and errors. And even with 15 cloud engineers running operations, it became unmanageable, compromising compliance. So even if the team could scale out fast enough, which they couldn't, the operations and infrastructure cost would skyrocket, as does the size of your backlog and the inability to meet the business demand. So you can imagine what the weekly ops review with the business unit started to look like after several months.
Oh boy, that's quite a predicament. I kind of now get where you're coming from, man. It sounds like it comes down to preparedness, really, to control the task storm, you could almost say. Surely cloud teams want to avoid getting into a situation like that. How could they go about that?
So with the retailer, after watching the operations team operate for a couple of weeks, it was quite apparent that only 10 simple technical tasks was taking the team upwards of 40 hours across 2 or more weeks to implement, on top of all their other day-to-day tasks. And so this is going to sound a little cliche, but you just really have to automate these tasks. It's really that simple. I mean, getting those 40 hours back and fulfilling a change request in less than an hour or so, it's not going to happen unless you actually start to automate.
That's right, but also easier said than done. Isn't there a big automation debt?
Yes, today it takes a lot of scripting and maintenance, and based on the tasks you can schedule and events you can predict, You're right, writing the code to talk to APIs across your service boundaries is where a lot of teams find a lot of difficulty. And it takes significant DevOps skills and a deep understanding of AWS services and architecture, as well as time. And this is all before you get to the reduction in tasks and cost and risk. So like I said, adding talent to these teams is difficult nowadays.
I see another predicament there, but you and our product team and engineering team at MontyCloud did find a better way, right? How do you make CloudOps simple and help customers break out of the automation debt?
So first of all, AWS does a brilliant job at offering these rich API sets across both the resources that make up the building blocks for your application and the tools to deploy, manage, and secure those constituents. Think of CloudFormation to provision infrastructure as code, you got Systems Manager to manage your EC2 fleet, IAM roles to secure access, just to name a few. But to take full advantage of cloud native APIs, you need the code to stitch them together, and that is across your service and tooling boundaries so that it works for you in your application context. And you have these different architectures powered by various infrastructure and database instances, clusters managed by multiple tools. And of course, this could be occurring across multiple accounts and multiple regions. There's a lot of code to write there for a DevOps team, provided you understand really what outcome you're trying to build for. And ultimately, it makes you realize that you need to do this deliberately and consistently. And if you don't, it can get very ugly, as it did for our customer in the luxury retail business.
I can only imagine. I mean, most IT are not necessarily skilled DevOps engineers and Python experts. So again, how do you solve this problem for IT teams, or should I say cloud centers of excellence?
We need to break down what a deployment really means, or in our case, a day two blueprint. And in order to attain operational excellence, you must take into account that both your deployment and an operation template. Now, without an operation template, you hit the same predicament that our retail customer encountered. The app is deployed, but here's the team drowning in tasks.
So why not standardize your scripts? Put them in a common repository and reduce script writing time?
When you flip the coin over and try to establish a one-size-fits-all standards for operations, you then quickly encounter that the generic operations playbook has no real tie back to the deployment templates. And you end up with this generic tooling and automations that never make a huge dent in your backlog. Now, standardizing your ops tooling does help, but you can find that generic playbook approach will only meet maybe 30–40% of your needs because every application is different. So when you design your architecture, that is when you also must design how you're going to operate it if you want to stay ahead of the task stream. And that's what we believe makes our day two blueprints different. We're planning for success by forcing the conversation on not just what needs to be built, but what must be defined and automated to successfully operate that application.
Now that sounds like a plan, and failure to plan is planning to fail.
Yeah, cliches exist because they're true, but here's what we've done to combat that task stream problem. So we've set up an entire library for our customers, featuring well-architected blueprints for over 20 common services, and that number is growing every week. These blueprints go from basic infrastructure build-out, so say pre-architected public and private VPCs, from EC2 and RDS deployments to container clusters, where there happens to be, say, Kubernetes or Fargate enabled, all the way to complex data analytics applications such as Elastic MapReduce and Elasticsearch. And that's important because we see blueprints being a combination of deployments and operations, which means every blueprint in our catalog is built with a health dashboard, monitoring metrics, and routine tasks out of the box. So by us completing all of the heavy lifting to get these templates compliant with AWS well-architected framework, our customers just get to click and deploy any blueprint on a self-service basis and take advantage of all of this work.
That's a value prop, Luke. All the time I hear folks screaming for self-service deployment capabilities to lower the threshold, get going faster with AWS, instead of burning precious time and cycles reinventing the wheel, and then hoping those didn't turn out square. Yes, I think this must certainly be based on no-code cloud operations to democratize cloud for the majority. Again, most cloud operators lack the skills or time to do it all themselves, and they aren't the problem. The problem is probably more in the unrealistic expectation that everyone touching cloud in any way can or should want to code. Now, I picked up on something else that was interesting in what you just said. You talked about post-deployment task automation. It's true that most operations come after the deployment. Things like managing IAM roles is one, well, I could say unpopular example. Is that kind of what you're going at?
That's a dilemma I was waiting for. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's certainly challenging to write a CloudFormation template to meet well-architected standards, but in an age where deployments are becoming more and more automated, it's no longer the big problem to solve. Let me share another war story here. Another customer we worked with had successfully automated the deployment of these data sets for a range of data scientists performing experiments on healthcare data. And these deployments created hundreds of S3 buckets every day. So it reduced their time to experiment significantly. They can access the data straight up, but it kept every project and each researcher isolated to meet their HIPAA needs. But next thing you know, operations grounds to a halt when they discovered it was very time intensive to unwind all of these deployments or even just modify and remove access to researchers who had left various projects. And it resulted in multiple P0 tickets and management calls. Now, these tasks themselves weren't technically difficult, but the sheer number of tasks, it simply crippled the team. I mean, operations was not included in the design phase. And this is exactly why it takes more to go from a deployment to a well-managed application.
Hey, can I interrupt you there for a second? You said a well-managed application. What does that mean?
Good question. In a nutshell, it's an application deployed in such a way that it can be managed efficiently, it's secure, and it's compliant. Because you remember, we always start the cloud journey with a deployment. And when you deploy an application that is manageable, that's when you can then manage that application well. We seem to be all about cliches today a little bit, but in all seriousness, it's much easier when you do it right from the start. And what comes next on the back of that deployment is your routine management tasks. So depending on the application and the resource and policy, this could be anything from adding and removing nodes, backup and restore, or configuring alerts. And these management tasks are more commonly known as a day 2 task. Now, bringing resources under management was usually a separate work stream in the past, including agent installation, setting access permissions, and governance policies. But instead of hoping that gets done, a well-managed application is aware of the context and is provisioned with the components and configurations and the routine management tasks at time of deployment.
So you're suggesting that with MontyCloud, your day 2 operations are pre-configured in the application's context?
Yes, I am. More than that, actually, because we created the ability to enable self-service tasks at an application level at the time of deployment. Then we also created a per application dashboard to actually monitor that deployment, that application, audit changes, perform those routine tasks, and that's something that can be done with a simple click or on an automated schedule, track and forecast resource level costs, and run reports for the business.
That's something different. I mean, you can see the entire production line coming together here is what I think. Again, the no-code self-service is hitting it home. I mean, talking of that, I have a question. Self-service can sometimes be a little bit scary. I mean, without the proper governance, users can break policy, compliance, budget, and what more. Have you thought about that as well?
Absolutely. Self-service is governed through guardrails, and this is all part of the routine tasks bundled into those blueprints to ensure that you can't move out of bounds. And in that S3 bucket dilemma we talked about before, a couple of really good examples. One is you want to have a self-service task that resets permissions, but the task should only be accessible to the researcher for that data set and your ops team, and perhaps scheduled to run on a regular basis. But you also may want to have another task that allows alert configuration for those alerts to be tweaked, but without the ability to remove or disable CloudTrail logs. So with the way we see it is that self-service guardrails are essential for a well-managed application.
Got it. Now, how did that work out for the luxury jeweler you talked about a while ago?
They're in a far better place now. I remember I said before it was taking weeks and months to execute those change requests. So we took the top 10 common tasks plaguing that team's backlog, built them into the day 2 blueprints, and it means now that these tasks are now included with the application deployment. Change requests at the application level are completed now within the hour, down from an average of what used to take them 40 hours over 2 weeks. So Not only did this automated deployment governed by guardrails reduce the time and cost, they now have monitoring and task automation set up at the time of the deployment. Our DevOps engineer, Garner, wrote a blog about this recently. So if you want to see a little bit more detail, you should be able to see this on montycloud.com/case studies, or just hit customers on our front page.
Cool. Thanks, Luke. I appreciate you talking or taking the time to talk and unpack the task automation issues and sharing proven solutions that are also quite accessible, as it seems. Can our listeners take a look at it themselves?
You're welcome, Rick. And yes, people can get a fully featured free trial. Day 2, it's a SaaS-based solution. We're cloud native. So there's nothing to install per se. And that also includes manage your instances. We are agentless. All you need to do is go to montycloud.com, hit the get started for free button, and you'll be able to connect your AWS account in no time with no code and no agents.
Brilliant. Guys, thanks for watching the OpsTalk podcast. On our next episode, we're going to be talking about the remote console feature, where you can gain shell level access to Windows and Linux instances without the need for VPNs, bastion hosts, or even granting access to the AWS console. Make sure you hit subscribe on our YouTube channel, and don't forget to click the bell to make sure you don't miss that episode. We look forward to talking to you soon, and then.